Welcome to the FarmBits podcast, a product of Nebraska Extension Digital Agriculture. I'm Jackson Stansel.
And I'm Samantha Teeton.
And we come to you each week to discuss the trends, the realities, and the value of digital agriculture.
Through interviews and panels with experts, producers, and innovators from all sectors of digital technology, we hope that you step away from each episode with new practical knowledge of digital agriculture technology.
Welcome back to the FarmBits podcast for the fourth and final episode in the Digitizing Farm Management series.
Before we get started on today's content, we wanted to let you know about the upcoming Nebraska on-farm research meetings at the end of February. Join extension educators and producers to look at the results of over 100 farm trials this year.
For dates of the meetings and registration information, please check out the website for the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network that is listed in the podcast description.
And now, for this episode of the FarmBits podcast, we welcome Schwab, an implementation specialist with CropZilla Software.
CropZilla Software, which is based out of Dublin, Ohio, offers software platforms for desktop and mobile devices that enable the collection of farm data and allow farmers to analyze the cost of their operational and production practices and decisions on their bottom line.
The idea behind CropZilla grew out of its founder's need to move beyond spreadsheets in order to answer important questions about his farming operation.
As you'll learn from Sam, CropZilla has provided visibility into an often overlooked but nevertheless important aspect of per acre profitability, which is the cost of operational practices and machinery investments.
So let's jump right in and learn more about how CropZilla is digitizing farm operation decisions with Sam Schwab. So Sam, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved with CropZilla?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I first want to thank you guys for having me on here today. So my background is I actually grew up on a small family farm in northern Ohio, and we're mostly focused on specialty crops. And so when I say small, I mean, small. Yeah, we grow everything. Strawberries is our main thing, but we grow everything from asparagus, pumpkins, rhubarb. We have attempted red raspberries and starting blueberries this year. That's kind of my thing that I've been driving. So I'm still actively involved in that as well.
Very cool.
So
awesome.
then I went to University of Cincinnati and then moved up to Columbus to be closer to the farm, and came across CropZilla through their website actually, and that's how I initially found out about them too. So my farm, we never really went to farm shows or anything like that since we are so small, but I did come across them online, so that's how I got involved with CropZilla. And then I can go into a little more background on that as well, and just kind of run into
Sure.
what CropZilla is, if that works.
Sure,
Kind of ties into it. Because it was funny, when I went in, I met with Brian Watkins, one of the founders and the CEO of CropZilla, and he was showing me the enterprise software that we have. It was a desktop-based software. It is a desktop-based software, and I couldn't believe that anybody farmed without it. After we went through it, it was like, in my whole history of farming, we just had, boxes and drawers of papers, and we got them out sometimes during tax season. And this kind of just like opened my mind up to a whole different level of farming. And what CropZilla or the enterprise desktop version is, we built a complete model of your farm. So it involved your fields. We put in your actual field boundaries on there. So, and we ran a field efficiency calculator on there to figure out, what is the optimal path across the field? What is your optimal equipment width on this field? Does all of that for your fields. You put in your actual equipment, your employees, yourself included, if you're out running equipment. So all of it is tailored specifically to your farm. And then what you did is, entering this information, you actually plan out every path that's going to happen on a field, and it makes it's an excellent budgeting and planning tool like that. But then the really cool thing is, once you have this model built, you can actually start swapping things in and out to see how it affects your operations. So you can look at, I've had tons of different, we call them scenarios, and it's, our main thing is swapping out equipment. So sprayers, combines, implements like headers, planters, things like that, changing sizes, changing speeds, just about everything you can think of under the sun. There's other ones that I've gone through with people where they are looking at adding different crops, going organic, picking up new land, seeing what they can afford to pay in rent on land that they're looking at picking up. So changing practices, cover crops, strip tilling. I could go, the list goes on, but you get the idea. Just about everything under the sun on that one. So that's kind of, in a really quick nutshell, what the CropZilla enterprise planning tool is. One thing that led to is, this is all user entered. It was a lot of work on the user. They had to go through, they could send us the fields and things like that, but they still had to go through, put in all their equipment. You even put in your inputs, your seeds, chemicals, things like that. So it makes it an excellent, planning tool. But there's also a lot of other companies out there that do field by field planning and field by field level profitability. So CropZilla did offer that, but our strong point was the scenario or decision modeling. And so the strongest point on that we had was our equipment modeling. So equipment costs range from, about $60 an acre to over $200 an acre, depending on, how far away the field is, what equipment you're using, what crop is on it. So there's a big range of equipment costs that people really don't have a good handle on. Mm-hmm. And with CropZilla, we got a really good handle on that, but it was all user entered. So we were dependent on the grower for things like, how fast can you go across the field? How much idle time is there? And everything in the model was pretty much, the optimal speed. They always put in their optimal speed. There was no wasted time, basically. Mm-hmm. And so we found out that the missing thing was what was actually happening in the field. Mm-hmm. You can have a model, but that hardly ever reflects what actually happens in the field. And so we actually took what's called telemetry. And, there's some John Deere OEM manufacturers that have this on their equipment, but it just seems, mm-hmm. It's just kind of they can watch where their stuff is or get some data from that. But what we took this telemetry data and applied it to our cost model to get exactly, how long you spent in the field, how much the speed you went, how much idle time there was, your field efficiency based on your path across the field. And we even can capture things like, travel to and from fields. Anytime the key is on, we are tracking that data. We can apply a cost to it. So you went a mile per hour slower than what you thought. What's that cost on that? You took a less efficient path across the field, or you had to go around a waterway or something like that. How much did that cost? You had 5 hours of idle time while your guys were eating lunch at the shop there. How much does that cost? Mm-hmm. So we actually took our model and applied this in-field data, and that's how we ended up with CropZilla Machine Analytics, which is our app that can be still used on the desktop. We optimized it for iPads, since that's kind of like every farmer's carrying around an iPad now.
Sure.
And it can be used on a phone, but it's a little cramped. So that's our current offering, is the CropZilla Machine Analytics. And we can also do scenarios on that based on what actually happened in the field rather than just the model.
So is that kind of relying on a partnership with another company to provide some of those telemetry services there from the tractor cab to y'all service, or is it like plugging in an iPad to the monitor there in the cab, or how are y'all getting that data?
So currently we are working we have an API through John Deere, and so we can capture their telematics data that they're actually using themselves. We also have some agreements with third-party telemetry providers, which is actually kind of nice because you can plug them into literally anything. So we've got them, mm-hmm. You can plug them right into tractors, you can plug them into pickup trucks, grain hauling trucks, and get costs for travel on those kind of things. And so that is nice that we can do the third party. And then we're actually in process of developing our own, where it is using an iPad location And so it'll just be another app that they click on when they get into the tractor and they turn the iPad on and can use that. So that
Sure.
one's in process. So.
So what are some of the challenges that you've run into in terms of trying to interpret data from different manufacturers? I know this is one thing that we talk about a lot in our group is like, we want everything to be colorblind on the data side, right? So like all your red tractors are the same as your green tractors. So, I mean, how are y'all able to interpret all this data and kind of mesh it into your analytics platform and have things work the right way?
Yep. So it is a process getting any new telemetry provider up and running with CropZilla. And we have an API directly to John Deere that allows us to capture that data. And I mean, that is a hassle trying to interpret that data. But, once you get it set up, then it's pretty much off and running. One of the biggest things is getting accurate data. So we've had telemetry providers where there's connection issues, it's difficult to set up because we're just on the software side, so we're kind of dependent on third parties or OEMs running this kind of stuff, and some of them didn't collect everything we needed. But I mean, once you got one OEM, now we have the process for that, and now that we've got a couple of third parties, we've been through that whole thing. And so it's actually going to be a little easier for us to continually add additional third-party users. But there is definitely a development issue with getting started with interpreting that data.
So is most of it through the telematics or some of it by like directly getting the CAN data with the CAN ports in some of the machinery?
So the nice thing with these third-party devices is they don't really need to plug into the CAN. They really only need switch power. So they fuses, battery, anything that it can be connected to. We can even plug them into just the auxiliary power ports that are in John Deere tractors or case tractors or things like that. What we got from the CAN was fuel use. So with our model, we can actually use horsepower or fuel economy on trucks in that case and then also combine with all the telemetry data, how fast they were going, how long they were idling, to get a pretty accurate estimate on it. But we found that fuel use is actually one of the smaller portions of total equipment costs, because not only do you have depreciation on equipment, you've got a lot of repairs, insurance on that. And we found that fuel costs, and labor. So that's another one that's larger than fuel costs. We found that fuel costs are actually a pretty small percentage of what the cost in the field is. And so even if we're estimating it, it's going to be even closer. It's not like we're completely forgetting about it. But we thought that was a fair trade to go with, ease of installation versus having CAN data all the time. So it's like, it might be 12 cents an acre and we're estimating 11 cents or 13 or something like that. So we're pretty close even with our estimates on that. So
I know we're skipping around. I was going to go back to some of the scenario building, unless Jackson is that.
Nope. Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So thinking about some of these scenarios, I think it sounds like really the bread and butter of it is the machinery side. Is that correct? So
yes.
Can you kind of go into that a little bit? Like how much other parameters does the grower have to put in? Do they have to know like those labor costs or some of that stuff? Or can you just kind of describe some of those scenarios?
Yeah, so there is still some inputs for the user, but again, this isn't something that you would need to do in the cab every time you turn the tractor on, something like this. This can all be done on the back end, or somebody in the office running this. Somebody can be in charge of it and they're doing it. So there is a little bit of setup. The nice thing is with the John Deere API is we can automatically pull in the equipment, and we can pull in their fields and things like that without having to do user entry. Otherwise, there is still, if they're using third-party devices, they don't have the equipment in there, so they can still put that in. But once you have it in there, you're done for the year basically, unless you get something
Right.
new. So it's not like you're in there every week adding equipment or changing equipment. And then kind of going into the scenarios on that is again, since we knew that our equipment costing was our strong point with CropZilla desktop, we took that, and that's why we have CropZilla Machine Analytics. And a big thing with the scenario is cost versus capacity. So if you're running old broken down equipment that's breaking down in the planting season, that might be cheaper, but in the long run, you're losing out on bushels. You might get, just last year in Ohio, I don't know about your guys' areas, but we had record prevent plant acres. And so people just couldn't get it planted. It was too wet. And, you're going to get even less planted if you have equipment that's breaking down.
Right.
The big thing is managing your cost versus your capacity. And that's what we're trying to do with these scenarios is, a new piece of equipment. A good example might be adding tracks to a piece of equipment. That's going to be expensive. Let's say it's I don't know, $10,000 more expensive a year. But actually, when you break it down over per acre, that might come out to be $2 or $3 an acre. And if you break that down even further, that's about a bushel of corn. So is a bushel of corn doable? So we still rely a little bit on farmer intuition for these, but we can give them the tools that they need to make sure, is this cost effective? So if they can cover it by again, increases in yield or increases in timeliness, or if they go from 3 machines to 2 machines, they might make it up with labor savings, things like that. We can give them the numbers, but they still need to take that and use that with their farmer intuition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's similar to things that we've heard, on kind of like the management zone side on more of the agronomics that the farmer intuition has to really play a huge part in this. And so I guess one question I have is how exactly was farmers' input incorporated into how you design the software and how you kind of present that data to them? Because I imagine that's a huge focus for what CropZilla does.
The biggest input is switching from the enterprise level to the app, because the inputs were a big issue with a lot of farmers, going out and planting through every field. If they were especially if they're doing that somewhere else already, a lot of farmers already have something that they're already putting that into. That's why when we went to CZMA, the CropZilla Machine Analytics, there's so many less inputs. We streamlined it. You can get it set up in about 15 minutes rather than 3 days. So that was one of the biggest things. I mean, when CropZilla initially started, it was when the enterprise desktop version was initially started, was corn, soybeans, and wheat were the only crops it could handle, and it couldn't even handle baling straw after wheat. So and now it's to the point where you could run just about any crop through there and then make it work. Even ones that aren't planted every year, if you're looking at like alfalfa or something like that, you can pretty much run through any row crop and have it give you the answers that you need. But then, when we went to CZMA, it was all about streamlining it, making it as easy as possible. I would try and gather everything automatically that we can. But that was the biggest thing is the input time. And then obviously we also ask, what do farmers want to see in the reporting? And so a lot of our reporting is based on feedback that we've gotten, and we continually are updating it and adding to it.
Sure.
I think I know the answer to this already, but what decision-making processes has digitization most revolutionized, and how so? So I think you already really hit on it's providing a value, and then the farmer can then make some decisions based upon that, but it's putting some numbers to it. Can you maybe go into that, or what do you really think has been revolutionized?
Yeah, and you kind of summed it up there really well. I'll try and gather my thoughts here. I mean, as I mentioned, giving the farmer that number, and then they can decide if it makes sense to them or not, is a huge one. Making these costs visible, because farmers don't really know. They might an extra fungicide pass might say it'll get you an extra, I don't know, 5 bushel an acre or something like that, but maybe they're not taking into account what you're using to apply it with, or your costs associated with putting it on, because you got to pay for the machine, equipment, fuel, labor, all of those things. They might just be, well, this is X number of dollars per acre, and you'll make this much more, but they're not taking into account all those other things. So making these costs visible is the first step in, being able to make decisions with them.
I think that's a great way how you describe that because we do a lot of like on farm research and we think about like sometimes we just think about the direct return of the partial profit, but we don't think about the whole farm picture and what that can influence. So I think that's awesome. And then like building on that, can they put on farm research results into this to do some comparisons or inform your models?
So they can definitely with CropZilla, the enterprise software. So we still have people using that, actively using that, and hopefully we're hoping in the future to be able to bring those two together. The things that we found most interesting are people who get demo equipment. They have
Hmm.
dealers come out to their fields with a new combine or a new planter or something like that, some sort of tillage tool, and we can actually still track those versus what they actually own already to give them an idea of, would it make sense to go with this or should we keep what we currently have? So there are some on-farm trials like that we can actually track and again put a cost on and use it to compare to their current setup.
That's
That's cool.
awesome.
Yeah. So I guess one question I have, in this whole machinery realm, it seems like machinery value is a really important piece of the puzzle. So how exactly is CropZilla going about getting those machinery value numbers? Is this like kind of like crowdsourced information? Is this, specific to your local market or maybe your location and where that value is? Is it relying on what the farmer is putting in there for maybe what they may purchase a new machine for? Just could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so we always rely on the farmer for a lot of this stuff because this is their model. It's not ours. They can personalize it to
Hmm.
however they want. Um, but in the past, when we're setting them up, either they have a depreciation schedule that they use, and we can use that. There's appraisal websites. In the past, we've used online appraisal websites that use past sales as sources of data. And then we've actually gotten to the point where we've had quite a bit of equipment go through that we've seen, and we can actually use that either, and especially if they had just recently bought something new, they already basically know the value on that
Sure.
piece of equipment. And then, going to the other side of when they're thinking of actually making trades or lease decisions or something along those lines, the dealer is giving them a price not only for the new piece of equipment, but usually a trade-in value on the old piece of equipment. So when you're looking at scenarios, you're using actual numbers that the dealer is giving you. So that's probably the best way to get it because
Hmm.
you actually have an offer on the table for those
Exactly.
things. So that's kind of just how we get those values. Again, there's other numbers that go in, repair numbers. We have a database of repair numbers, but we often rely on farmers because we don't really know what equipment is going to be on a if they just say some combine, is it tracks, is it tires, is this planter have precision equipment on it, does it have all kinds there's a lot of variance between even the same model.
Sure. And so you kind of alluded to this a little bit. How much is CropZilla using aggregated data not only for like machinery decisions, but also other sorts of decision support, or are they even using it at all? And I think this may lead us down like a data privacy and data usage conversation here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the biggest source there is going to be values, and we use just kind of things that we've collected, but we never tell people like our data privacy is number one. Basically, the farmer owns all their data. We don't give it to anybody else. Um, Even if, just to put it in perspective, if somebody bought CropZilla, the farmers have to sign off again to allow whoever purchases CropZilla to use that data. So they're protected even if CropZilla goes somewhere or like gets sold or something like that. They're protected. We tried to make it on all levels because that is a
Yeah,
huge deal with
absolutely.
farmers. So um, and then I got off on the question here, but aggregate data, we are working on a benchmarking system. The nice thing about CropZilla is it takes, like you said, being colorblind, it takes all of that out of there. It takes out, uh, manufacturer, takes out, what optional equipment they are, and gets down to a true cost per acre for planting or harvest like that. And you can actually use that number across uh, everybody basically. So it's, because we kind of take that information out of the picture with whether it's John Deere or Case or those things. So
Hmm.
we can actually get down to a true cost per acre and use that to compare different users.
Since we have brought up the data privacy part, just a quick question. So you're two different, like the enterprise and then the app, correct? Am I
Yes.
distinguishing this correctly? Is there any differences there where like the enterprise, is that on the grower's desktop and they're the only ones who can see it? Or can you guys still access that if they need help or something like that? And do you have more access to the app? Is there any differences there?
Not really. The app, the only difference is multiple people can be logged in at the same time. With the enterprise software, it is saved to the cloud. And so you can have it on multiple desktops and all have access to it. If you're at the farm or at the house or something like that, but you can only one person can be editing it at a time. But with the app, you can have multiple people using it at the same time, as long as you're not changing the same data, which you really won't run into very often.
Mhm.
So we have the same, privacy agreements between both of them. So there's no difference there really.
Okay.
So this is just kind of going back to some stuff that we've already talked about. And I just want to dig into it a little bit more. But so does CropZilla have the option in its functionality to kind of build an entire economic analysis of every acre? So like including all input costs, obviously machinery costs, labor costs, like every different facet. Is it capable of completely economically modeling your farm, or is it mostly kind of concerned with looking at the margins? Like what are those differences, for certain pieces of your operation? You would still have to integrate with other, I guess, data or other programs in order to get those, input related costs for each year.
So our enterprise software will actually go all the way down to field level profitability. So you're going through, you're putting in your inputs, what seed, fertilizer, chemicals you're putting on, you can put in yields, things like that. Every aspect can be put in there and go down to a total economic model.
Mm-hmm.
We even account for things like cost of drying grain or and trucking and things along those lines. So we tried to make that as accurate as possible, but again, it was a lot of inputs, and especially if
Sure.
somebody already has that information somewhere else and they're having to put it in maybe twice. With CropZilla Machine Analytics, obviously in the name there, we're just focused on the machinery aspect of it. So that is strictly getting a cost and making equipment decisions on there.
So is that equipment cost going to be something that you may try to integrate with some other platforms out there? Like, I don't know, for example, a Granular that's trying to do some of that full farm economic modeling. Is that something that you could foresee CropZilla wanting to allow that data to be imported into a program like that eventually for growers?
Yeah, I mean, if growers are users of both, they can take it out of there and put it in.
Okay.
I'm not sure if Granular has
Sure.
a entry for that, or if they use.
Sure.
A lot of people are using like the custom rates or Iowa's custom rates or something along those lines.
Sure.
But if they are users of both, we haven't really discussed with any other companies about automatically or building an API or anything like that yet.
Sure.
But yeah, again, if they have both CropZilla and another management software, they can feel free to transfer those over and use them in their other software systems.
Great.
I just also want to clarify. So a lot of this has been talked on like the costs, and we're getting a really great number on the cost. How much of this are you guys trying to avoid the forecasting part of it? So like, if you can't put in yield, but are we putting in yield goals to then try to figure out what it will be next year? Because that can get a little bit dangerous, but it's also a lot of it's very valuable as well. So
yeah, the nice thing is about CropZilla is you can change anything in there as kind of an as if model. So you want to see what your bottom line is with higher soybean price or lower corn price or anything like that. You can just plug it in, look at your bottom line, and then change it back. So it's actually very easy to do those type of analysis. And you can see that with different things like one thing that we've done with equipment is speed. You can flip speed around, see how it affects your timeliness and your cost. You can make changes very quickly in it, which is nice. And see again, the big thing is driving it down to that bottom line. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like the whole paradigm is just to give farmers a platform to test things. I mean, it's literally like a virtual simulation for their farm financials.
Yeah, and that is the nice thing about having it specific to their farm. They're not just putting in and putting it on an average farm. They're putting it on their actual farm setup.
So I'm sure that there were growers out there who are kind of trying to do this on spreadsheets for years and trying to build their own model. But here comes a software that has taken all those spreadsheets and kind of consolidated it down to one. It's kind of what I'm getting. I didn't
really go into that story, but Brian Watkins, the founder, his story, his background on why he created CropZilla is that very reason. Is he had his spreadsheets, and you could change one thing in there, but it doesn't always flow through. Like if you're using a tractor more on planting, how does it, if you use the same one for grain cart, how does it affect your cost on grain cart? Things like that, where it's not all connected and you don't even think about how everything's interconnected on a farm. And so he didn't have the tools that he needed, because he's a farmer as well in Kenton, Ohio here. He didn't have the tools he needed to make those decisions. So, I mean, yeah, spreadsheets can be, good. They're still some of the best. I think Excel is one of the best programs ever created.
Sure.
But still having that interconnectivity where you don't think about how one change might affect another part of your operation. And so that is literally the background of CropZilla. Is he didn't have what he needed to make decisions. So build it.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you have any specific stories of maybe when you were helping a farmer, or with your own experience, that's really stood out to you of like, this really helped a farmer make a decision that would have not been possible otherwise? I know that's like really putting you on the spot.
I've got a funny one and a real one. So I'll tell the funny one first because it's shorter. But this was when we first started the telemetry. Is one of our growers needed a map of where he drove that day, because one of his neighbors said he ran over his mailbox. So we built him a map of where he went, and he took it over to his neighbor and said, "I didn't even drive past your mailbox this day, so it couldn't have been me." So real-time example of it. But I've got a couple of them. One dealing with equipment scenarios is, we had somebody who was looking at purchasing some more land that came up for sale, and he wanted to free up some funds. And with combines, how expensive they are. They were running three combines. So they actually were looking at leasing 2 combines with larger capacity versus the 3 machines, to free up all of that capital that's tied up in your equipment to purchase this land. And so there was tons of moving parts in this one. There was labor changes because they only needed 2 operators. There was equipment changes because they were looking at the lease. There was land changes because they were looking at picking up more land and how it would affect the bottom line. So that one was a very interesting one, because I had no idea how it was going to turn out at the beginning of that when he was telling me about it. So that was a very interesting one just to look at. And we've had other small ones like just changing planter size, header size, boom width on a sprayer. So we've had quite a selection of different scenarios.
Anything for blueberry farms?
No, not yet, but okay. after maybe this year, after I plant mine, we'll see.
There you go. Now that you have kind of the CZMA figured out and are moving in that direction, have something out there on the market, what other evolutions do you see in the future of CropZilla, and what other problems are you going to try to tackle here in the coming years?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the reason we went to CZMA is because that was where we were really strong, and we saw that we were the only ones doing that accurate machine costing using telemetry and helping with decision support. There's a lot of other ones out there doing things like labor management, inventory management, farm planning, that kind of thing. And so with CZMA, we really wanted to dial that in. The next step for us is not only when you're running scenarios right now, we only have the ability in CZMA to change like values. So you're trading a tractor for another tractor of the same size, combine, same thing like that. The next step for us is we want to be able to use your data that you actually collected in the field and look at, okay, if we have a 40-foot planter, what would it look like with a 60-foot planter? Or if we were running at 4 miles an hour, what would happen if we got a high-speed planter and we're going at 7? So that's our next big step, is changing the parameters of what you did in the field to see how it would affect your bottom line. So that's our big next step. Again, we can do that in CropZilla Enterprise right now, but again, that's just the model numbers. We want to figure out a way to use the actual numbers that happen in the field to let you know how that would affect your operation.
Mhm.
Sure.
So, yeah, you got the pieces there. It'll be interesting as you put it together. Yeah.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. So one thing that I just wanted to kind of mention again with CropZilla, and thinking just for anybody who's thinking about equipment changes, this doesn't have to be, with CropZilla related. The big thing is that cost versus capacity issue. You can spend all kinds of money and get planning done in a day or two, but then that's going to be way more expensive than you're ever going to see in a return. And again, I had mentioned the example of running old busted equipment where you might miss out on planting half your acres in a wet season. So that is a big thing to think about on any operation. And again, this could be for anybody, not just CropZilla users.
So if anyone is interested in CropZilla and wants to learn more or try it out on themselves, how would you suggest they get started?
Highly recommend going to CropZilla.com. And on there, we have all of our contact information. And actually, if you fill it out, you'll probably get me, or you'll get right to Brian. So we'll get back to you. And then, if you want to follow along with what we're doing, there's a newsletter sign up on that site as well. And we're somewhat active on Twitter when I have spare time.
That sounds about like our situation here at the FarmBits podcast.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, you're so busy creating the content. It's like, okay, well, we still got to get this out there. So.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. So you kind of gave a little bit of advice, as far as how people can go about improving their operations. But do you have any just more general advice in terms of operational efficiency or improving profit on their farm from your experience there working at CropZilla?
Yeah. So kind of going back to that, a lot of farmers have, they have their fertilizer, their seed, all of that down to literally the penny per unit on that. And so trying to get a handle on your equipment cost is a big part of that. But a big thing with that is, new equipment isn't always more expensive because, like I mentioned, you can get it back with yield increases, with timeliness increases, and you can't just completely replace the farmer intuition with a software. So I don't know if that's really advice, but new equipment isn't always a bad choice for those who are, trying to watch their equipment costs.
No, I think that's great. And I think it's one of those things that often gets overlooked. I think we usually see the big number, but as you mentioned earlier, we don't always see it in terms of the dollars per acre and kind of get it in the same units as we measure everything else. So
yeah, that's a big thing. And as I mentioned with, benchmarking, it's all get it down to that cost per acre, and you can compare that to anyone else and get a good handle on it there. It takes all of the emotion out of it, I guess. So.
Sure.
It was great talking about machinery and decision-making value using CropZilla with Sam Schwab. My favorite part of this episode is thinking about how some of those small aspects of making large farming decisions are often overlooked. Things such as labor, if you can now spend less time in the field, or fuel efficiency, and how CropZilla can help you feel better about those decisions you're making.
Yeah, I think those are all great aspects about what Sam talked about today. And many of our speakers have also alluded to this, but he also talked about how data management and calculations were so manual and bulky before some of these digital platforms like CropZilla came about. You know, it was always lots of notepads or spreadsheets that growers were trying to use to get to these answers. But digital technology has provided tools that make the data collection and recording and then decision making that goes into those processes a lot easier. And really with CropZilla, I just really like the concept of giving farmers kind of this flexible platform that allows them to model a lot of different decisions and just make better decisions that will benefit their bottom line. And so that flexibility is a really underrated aspect, I think, of software in general today.
Yeah, those are great points. So, thanks for joining us today as we took a look at the economic side of machinery and how to make better decisions on your farm using digital technology.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback, so if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us over email, on Twitter, or in the review section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can also be found in the show notes.
We would like to thank Nebraska Extension for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality informational material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska and beyond.
The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the views of Nebraska Extension or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of FarmBits.